Legendary Canadian singer-songwriter Robbie Robertson has died after a long illness. Robertson led the Canadian-American group The Band to rock prominence in the 1970s with hits like The Weight, The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, and Up on Cripple Creek. Robertson also worked extensively with Bob Dylan and Martin Scorsese. And after the band's 1976 farewell concert, The Last Waltz, was captured on film by Scorsese, Robertson worked with the director as a composer and music supervisor. Their long list of films together include hits like Raging Bull, The Color of Money, The Departed, and The Wolf of Wall Street. Robbie Robertson was 80 years old. And for more, we've connected with Eric Alper. He's a publicist and music commentator. Eric, this is some very sad news for the music world, particularly here in Canada. What's your reaction?
Shock, sadness. I mean, this is one of the leaders of this country's greatest band. Certainly the most influential band that this country has ever had. You know, when you go through the sheer list of artists that followed in the band's wake, from everybody from the Beatles, especially with George Harrison. If you took a look at the Beatles photos when they were breaking up, they were looking like members of the band. They were wearing, brown suits and had their hair long and beards, all the way up to Taylor Swift. In fact, her last couple of albums, including Folklore and Evermore, are directly influenced by the band's music that they helped create a whole new genre of music in terms of folk rock and alternative Americana. With Robbie's ability to just mix folk music and rock music and country and take his influences, being in Canada, simply astonishing what he was able to create. And it's no wonder that he ended up working in the film world since his songs were so full of very, very vivid imagery and narratives and emotions that it fit neatly both in the music world and the film world.
It's so interesting hearing you talk about the way he has influenced other musicians. I had the chance to actually interview him. It was probably 7 years ago, when his book Testimony came out. And I remember when talking to him, he wasn't a name dropper, but he quietly talked about those who he had worked with. And it wasn't just in the past, but also, he talked about The Weeknd, artists who he admired who were current. And all of these artists, as you say, were influenced by him, but he sort of quietly, the band was a sort of a quiet influence. This wasn't they didn't appear to be a group that was all about the fame.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned about those artists that are now in current, because you kind of struggle a little bit to go, like, how do you go from the band to The Weeknd? Well, the fact of the matter is that because the band, and especially Robbie Robertson, has such a willingness to experiment with so many different sounds and instruments and arrangements, he encouraged not only himself internally, but the rest of the band, the rest of the music industry, and the rest of the artistic world to take on innovation, to not be afraid of using little bits and pieces from here and here and here. And that opens up a door to a house that is, you can't even imagine what it is. Sometimes it's never just in the details of The Weight or or Dixie. It's the fact of how they carried themselves maybe means a little bit more to these artists than, being influenced by that chord or that electric guitar.
What I also found so interesting about Robbie Robertson is that where his musical influence began here in Canada. He's from Toronto. He had family on 6 Nations of the Grand River Reserve, and he talks in his book, and we were talking about how as a child he went to visit those family members, saw that they could all play music, and as a child he couldn't, but then realized how much music was in him, and how that just the expression of music at 6 Nations sort of really fueled him throughout his adult life.
Yeah, it's something that a lot of Indigenous artists actually speak about. People from Buffy St. Marie to Tom Wilson, and even somebody like Gord Downey that may not have grown up on a reserve, but absolutely was influenced by our Indigenous people and the culture. And it never leaves you. It's more of a spirit thing. It's more of an influence, not only in terms of songwriting or musical style or production, but it actually forms your being as a human, and how you deal with people, and how to craft those really compelling stories through music, how to tell and be able to hold up a mirror to who we are as people and who we are as a city of Toronto and a province and a country so different from America, but yet he was able to kind of have the rest of the world take notice about what he was doing.
Yeah, he went from Toronto, he went from family and the Six Nations to working with the likes of Martin Scorsese on movies that probably there are many Canadians who wouldn't even have realized that he took part in. Wolf of Wall Street, one of the more recent, but not less notable than Raging Bull in terms of films. And then there's The Last Waltz, which for younger Canadians might not realize what an influential work of film and music that was. What do you think is, if you can, what's the most remarkable thing about Robbie Robertson's career that maybe Canadians aren't aware of but should know?
You know what? This is gonna sound really awful. I just thought he was one of the coolest people on the planet.
Right.
I mean, the way that he carried himself, the people he was hanging with, from Eric Clapton to Bob Dylan to Martin to Van Morrison, the way that he looked in the videos in the 80s, 25 years after the band started. Here he was with his own solo work, getting 5 stars across the board in Rolling Stone magazine. He was already in his late 30s, 40s, mid 40s, and he was still the coolest person on the planet. There is nobody that I've ever been around Robbie to look at from behind him and see the reverence that people have of him, and just imagine for a moment what it would be like to be Robbie Robertson with that history behind you, where you could really do no wrong, hanging out with who you were hanging out with, and producing quality music after album for so long. It's astonishing, really.
Yeah, somebody with such quiet confidence that they didn't need to he never needed to broadcast that. Just if you were in the know as to who he was.
We did it all for him.
Yeah, you just knew. He was the cool of Canada. Eric Alper, thank you so much. Eric Alper is a publicist and music commentator speaking with us from Toronto.